of the war in Afghanistan making us safer, it's turned yet another country against the United States. Pakistan, I've been there 4 times as well. When I first went there, the right-wing extremists, the Muslim extremists, had virtually no support. They couldn't win an election for mayor. Today, there's a virtual civil war with those folks having a lot of support. What's different? The U.S. war in Afghanistan. The so-called Taliban in Pakistan didn't exist before the U.S. invasion. It simply didn't exist. It has come into existence, allegedly, to fight the foreign occupation. And today in Pakistan, the al-Qaeda and Osama bin Laden are extremely unpopular. Somewhere less than 15% public opinion polls show support for them. You know who's even less popular than Osama bin Laden? The United States government. Osama bin Laden is more popular than the United States government in public opinion polls in Pakistan. Now, you've got to really fight hard to get that low. But that's the results of the U.S. dropping these bombs, firing these missiles from drones, etc. Remember, from our perspective, it's always targeted missile attacks on selected key targets, killing only guilty individuals and militants, etc. If you're living in Pakistan, your aunt, your uncle, your cousins have all been killed, and including a lot, mostly civilians, in these raids, because we don't get half the truth of what's actually going on. So, just as in the old days during the Cold War, the U.S. hyped anti-communism. So everybody was a communist. If you go back to the 50s, 60s, so you had actual communists, you had socialists, you had nationalists, you had religious opponents, you had social democrats. Anybody who took a strong position against the U.S. empire in those days was labeled a communist. We invaded the Dominican Republic when we didn't like the government there, because there were a bunch of communists allegedly in the government. I mean, you can go back and trace it back. And of course, when you look back at it historically, the communist myth was inflated to a great degree in order to justify the U.S. expansion of its empire. And so, what do I mean? So what's really going on? What are the real reasons behind all of these wars? Well, let's take the example of Iraq. What does Iraq have? Any guesses? Say again?
Sand.
They have sand, yes. They're very big. They've cornered the sand market. Of course, oil. And they, depending on which estimates you believe, they've got the second or the third largest oil reserves in the world. And the U.S. is already allied with Saudi Arabia, which has the largest reserves. And the number 3 or number 2, again, depending on how you count it, is Iran. So it was sheer coincidence, of course, that the U.S. invaded Iraq with the idea that it was going to then topple the government in Iran and in Syria. So the U.S. empire needs strategic control of natural resources. And that means control of the Middle East. If you're going to control the oil resources, it means your oil companies get to do the drilling and the ownership of the oil. I mean, who are you going to give it to? The Chinese? So the intention was, by the Bush administration people, to invade Iraq, topple the government, privatize the state-owned oil companies, turn it over to U.S. and to a lesser extent British, because after all they were our allies, privatize them and make the oil revenues pay for the occupation of Iraq. That was the plan. It was not a secret. It was said at the time. Well, it didn't go as they planned because the Iraqi people didn't go along with the deal. And they started rebelling almost immediately. And there was particularly strong resistance to privatizing their oil companies. So that battle is still going on today. The U.S. and British oil oil rig companies have gotten the contracts to develop the oil fields and update the oil fields and so on. And some contracts have gone out to bid to American companies. Some have gone to Chinese companies, much to the chagrin of the United States. So the plan that did not work out the way they wanted it. But nevertheless, that was indeed the plan. And if you're going to control oil supplies in a region, then you need a military that can guarantee the pipelines that get the oil out and the shipping lanes that get the oil out. So you need aircraft carriers and land bases and so on. So you have a military component. And then, of course, you need to have friendly governments in power. So what you say is you're bringing democracy, and apparently the functional definition of democracy for the United States is any authoritarian regime that holds elections a couple times. And that's an emerging democracy. So we've seen in Iraq, they held elections for parliament. 6 months later, they still don't have a government. In Afghanistan, they've held 2 elections with massive fraud. But it's important to, to understand that these are emerging democracies because they're pro-U.S.